Hi, I'm Jack, and welcome back because this time I'm going to give you guys an updated ranking of the Marvel Cinematic Universe from Iron Man all the way to the end of Hawkeye and the release of Spider-Man No Way Home. And before we get started, don't forget to follow me on social media. My username is down below at the bottom of the screen and in the description below, so don't forget to do that while you're at it. And spoilers will be talked about in this video, so if you haven't seen any of these movies or the shows yet, you might want to go watch all of them and then see yourself back here. And with that said, let's get started. In last place is Thor: The Dark World. Now, this movie I don't think is terrible. It's not a disaster, but this is easily the most mediocre movie to come out of this series. While it does have a great performance from Chris Hemsworth and Tom Hiddleston, and the cast was good, and even I liked how they filmed some of the winter scenes in Asgard, and even just the way they shot the movie for the most part is actually pretty good. But this movie is just the most boring of the films, and it also has the worst villain to come out of the entire MCU, and it's one of the more forgettable entries. There's some great things to be had here, but there's a lot of things that just do not work for this movie. So for that reason, Thor: Dark World comes in last place. Coming up next is The Incredible Hulk. Now, this is a standalone movie that I think it actually works pretty well. I thought Edward Norton was really good as Hulk and Bruce Banner in this movie. There's some cool action bits here and there, especially the fight between Hulk and Abomination, and it's a solidly paced movie here and there. But after phase one, I thought this movie kind of just fades into the background. It doesn't feel like they explored very much from here, even though we do get to see Abomination again in Shang-Chi, and we will see him again in She-Hulk. But in general, this is one of the more MCU movies that it worked as a standalone movie, but as placed in this wider cinematic universe, I don't think it works all that great. And certainly after phase one, it kind of just feels kind of like a weak entry compared to some of the other stuff we've got since then. So for that reason, it comes in where it is. Next up is Iron Man 2. Now, I love the first Iron Man movie, so I was really looking forward to starting this one. And while this movie isn't bad, it's just okay, because there are some good ideas to be had here, like focusing on Tony's alcohol problem and the fact that his arc reactor isn't just saving him, but also killing him. That's a great idea. And I love the introduction of Black Widow in this movie, and I really enjoyed some of those bits here and there, especially the fights between Iron Man and War Machine and Iron Man, War Machine and Whiplash and all those drones. That stuff is cool. But this is also one of the more fillery entries in the MCU because a lot of this movie feels pretty slow paced. There's very little action sequences here, and this movie feels more dead set on trying to set up the Avengers rather than tell a new Iron Man story. And some of the storylines weren't very well executed, and I thought Whiplash was not a good villain, even though I did enjoy Justin Hammer, and I would love to see him return in Armor Wars with Don Cheadle. But Iron Man 2 does have some fun moments here and there. It's certainly a watchable movie. It's just that it's the weakest of the Iron Man trilogy, and it has some things that just do not work as a movie, and certainly for that reason, it comes off more as a fillery installment in this expanding universe. Coming after Iron Man 2 is What If? I was really looking forward to this show. I thought the trailer, when they first revealed it, I thought looked great. I thought the animation I actually really like, and I like the idea of what if these certain events played out differently, like what if T'Challa was Star-Lord instead of Peter Quill and all that. I thought, oh, great idea, great concept, and I think there's some really interesting stuff they can do with it. And while there are episodes that I do really love, like the Strange Supreme one, like the What If Ultron one, and even like the finale and stuff, while there are some great episodes, as a whole, I did not find the show to be that exciting of an experience. And naturally, the highs would have been higher on this list, but the lows were also really low. I thought it had a weak episode to kick off with, and not every episode really capitalized on the potential of what if and alternate universes and things play out differently. And it just feels like these episodes should have been longer because some of them felt short. And I feel like some of these episodes just weren't all that exciting. They weren't all that great. except for a select few. And while there's some great animation, some great ideas, and certainly some cool new characters to come out of the show, I just thought that What If was a very underwhelming show, and it had some great ideas, but they never really capitalized on the potential, and I hope season 2 improves on that. Next up is Thor. Now, this is also one of the more better looking MCU movies. I liked how Asgard looks in this movie. It's easily the best Asgard has ever looked in the movies. And I enjoyed Chris Hemsworth, even though this is his first outing. And Tom Hiddleston is great as Loki, and Anthony Hopkins is great as Odin. And I liked all the Asgard stuff, especially the third act of this movie. And visually, it's a good looking movie. However, I did not find myself all that invested in the stuff happening on Earth. It just feels like we don't get to see much of Thor being Thor, but rather just see Thor try to learn what it means to be a hero, and I thought that's a good idea. But the tonal shift between Asgard and Earth is so drastic. It felt like I was watching a completely different movie, and they focused a lot more on the stuff happening on Earth rather than the stuff on Asgard. And I just feel like while Natalie Portman is a great actress, I didn't feel too much chemistry with these two characters, and a lot of it just comes down to the writing. And so, for that reason, Thor, it's a good movie. A standalone movie, it works on its own, but it's just a movie that I feel like it's watchable. It has some great moments here and there, and it is a great looking movie, but I definitely felt like I need a little bit more of Asgard and all of that than whatever was happening on Earth here. Coming up next is Captain Marvel. Now, the controversy around this movie, I think, was ridiculous, personally. I think Brie Larson is a terrific actress, and I was looking forward to seeing her in this movie, and I enjoyed her. Samuel L. Jackson, they both had a great dynamic with one another that made this movie a pretty watchable movie, and yes, I have watched this movie quite a few times, like almost every other MCU movie, but it's a fun little movie. It's not this big game-changing movie like Avengers Infinity War or Avengers Age of Ultron, but it's a fun little movie. It had some great moments here and there, but it's held back because I thought the first half of the movie feels a little slow. It just takes a while for this movie to really get going, and I thought the villains weren't all that compelling. They felt kind of bland and one note to me. And I certainly feel like this movie just could have been just a tad bit more longer with the story and all of that. And I wish there's more they explored with Captain Marvel. And then a problem too is while Brie Larson from a performance standpoint is great as Captain Marvel, they didn't write her to be all that compelling, and some of the reasons I do understand, I defend it, but then there are a few things about the character that I think could have been done better, and in the end, there are just some decisions they made from a writing standpoint that I just was not really a fan of, especially when they had the reason Nick lost his eye being the fact that just Goose scratched it. Didn't like that, and in a way, it kind of tarnishes some of the things I liked about Nick Fury as a character, and so in the end, it's a fun movie. I do enjoy watching it, but outside of that, it's not really a movie with a lot of high highs to get higher up on this list. Coming up next is Avengers Age of Ultron. Now, when I first heard about this movie way back then, I was pumped. I love Ultron as a character, and I was wondering, when are we going to get a second Avengers movie? So when I first watched it, I loved it. But over time, it became kind of one of the weaker installments in the MCU because while there are some fun moments to be had, visually it's a good looking movie, and I personally think it's a better looking movie than the first one. And we got to see a lot of these Avengers all together, which I do like. There's so much happening in this movie. This is one of the more overstuffed MCU movies, and in this way, sometimes it doesn't always work because this movie was trying to tell an Ultron story. It was trying to tell another Avengers story, and you also had all the Phase 3 setup, and because this was the movie that kicks off like Civil War, Infinity War, Thor Ragnarok, and all of that, and this movie feels like it tries to do way too much in its runtime, and at times it doesn't always succeed. And I did like the introductions to Scarlet Witch and Vision, and even Quicksilver, but some characters weren't fully capitalized here, especially Quicksilver, when they killed him off. And it's a good looking movie. It has some great moments, especially, but compared to the first Avengers movies and even Infinity War and Endgame, this is easily the weakest of the Avengers movies by far. Next up on the list is Ant-Man and the Wasp. Now, I actually find this to be a pretty fun movie, and I do think in times it's very overhated, especially when I go on social media. There's some funny moments here and there, and next up is Ant-Man and the Wasp. Now, I think this is a pretty overhated movie from what I've seen on social media. I thought, while it's an inferior follow-up to the first movie, I think it's a very well-paced movie. It's fast-paced, especially for an hour and 50-something minutes. It has some fun moments here and there. I did like some of the scenes between Scott and Cassie, and I liked seeing Hope Van Dyne finally become Wasp. And it's a fun movie here and there, so it's definitely one that it's not top tier MCU. It's not one of the MCU movies I ever see myself rewatching if I ever feel like rewatching one, but this is a fun movie. However, it is one of the most gray looking movies in the entire MCU. There are some great moments that aren't gray, especially in the quantum realm and such, but so much of this movie looks gray, and at times it looks really weird, especially when they have the cinematographer of Heat directing this movie. And it just feels weird that the villain has the same motivation as the hero, and they didn't team up or even try to help each other out until the third act, which was really strange. But some characters too just don't work all that well here, especially with what this movie was trying to tell. And so, inferior follow-up, but it's fun, even though it's not really one of the best of the bunch. In 24th place is Black Widow. When you saw my review for this movie, I gave it an A-, and it was the first MCU movie we've had since Far From Home came out 2 years prior. But the more I thought about it, I liked the movie, but I found quite a few problems I had with it. I thought Taskmaster was a disappointment, and I didn't think the other villains were that compelling. And I thought that the opening of this movie was really great. But then at times, I thought the third act feels way too big on CGI, and the action sequences, choreography-wise, were good, but I thought the editing at times feels really choppy at moments because it's always cutting to different angles. And I just feel like this is a movie that also feels like it came out way too late. It should have came out years earlier, because it feels weird to release this movie, especially after Endgame, where they killed her off. So it feels weird to release a Black Widow movie. But I did enjoy the performances. I thought Florence Pugh is excellent as Yelena, easily my favorite character out of this movie. I thought she was fun, and I really enjoyed David Harbour and Rachel Weisz as Red Guardian and Melina. And I enjoyed some of the more emotional moments, especially the family moments between Nat, Melina, Yelena, and Alexei. That stuff I think was great. The action set pieces and all that stuff I think is fine. Could have been better. But certainly it's a movie that I enjoy, but I certainly did not love it as much as I used to, because I did not think the villains were that great. And at times it feels like I understood and I knew where things were heading. In 23rd place is Spider-Man Far From Home. Now, I will say this. I do really enjoy this movie. It certainly is my least favorite of the MCU Spidey movies, and I love Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio. And I think from an action sequences standpoint and the visual effects and pacing, all three of those things I think are even better here than in Homecoming. But I think Far From Home had some weird moments. I didn't like how they characterized Aunt May, even though she was only in this movie for a few minutes. I didn't like that I think the teen comedy thing I don't dislike, but it just doesn't work all as much as the superhero stuff. And at times I feel like the humor doesn't land all that much for me. And I think it just feels weird that they're just having us realize that Peter and MJ are in love with each other here, but there wasn't any build up to it prior, not even in Homecoming. And there are just some scenes that I just feel like I could have done without, and I was not really big on the Edith plot line, just from a logic standpoint. But I still enjoyed it. I thought the action sequences are great. The third act is awesome. I love seeing Peter learn that he needs to pick up the responsibility. He needs to be Spider-Man as much as he wants to be on vacation. So There are some great things about Far From Home, and it is a watchable movie, and it is one that I do enjoy, with some great acting, great performance from Jake Gyllenhaal, and even awesome action sequences and visuals and cinematography work. There is some great stuff to be found here, but as a whole, I think it's a fun movie, but it has some flaws. Following that is Iron Man 3. I actually really enjoy this movie. I think it's probably one of the MCU movies that I think works better as a director-made movie. I certainly felt like this feels more like a Shane Black movie than an MCU movie. It certainly is a pretty witty movie at that, and I think it does a great job at it. It's fun, it's engaging, and I think it is easily a better Iron Man movie than Iron Man 2. And I thought that I really liked seeing Tony deal with PTSD after the events of the Avengers and how that really affected him in a negative way. And I really enjoyed seeing him try to fight the bad guys and to be this hero, even though he doesn't have his Iron Man suits always there for him. That I do really enjoy, and I really enjoyed watching that happen and just seeing Tony Stark be more down to earth in this movie. And I enjoyed his dynamic with Harley Keener. And I really enjoy the performances here, and I really enjoyed the ending. I think until Age of Ultron happened and all that, I think this was a nice way to cap off the trilogy. However, I actually wasn't bothered by the Mandarin twist, but I just thought the villain that they ended up giving us, not very good, did not find him compelling, and all that was just really weird. And it just feels weird the way they ended this movie, just knowing what happens in Age of Ultron and later on. And there are certainly some logic issues you can find here and there, but in general, I think Iron Man 3 is a great movie. I had fun with it. It's certainly the best of the Iron Man sequels, and it's a fun movie. Following that is WandaVision. I loved the first few episodes of the show. It was the first any MCU content ever since Far From Home, and I was really excited for it. I loved the trailers. And I had a fun time with the show, and I thought Elizabeth Olsen and Paul Bettany were great, especially Catherine Hahn and Randall Park and Teyana Paris and all that. There are some great moments throughout. I love the sitcom stuff a lot. It feels different and unique from the MCU, and I just love how it tries to just be a more character-driven show, and even it focuses on grief. And I really enjoyed that. And now we finally got to see the origin of how Wanda got her powers and how all of this happened. And I really enjoyed this mystery this show had. All that being said, I did not find the sword stuff very compelling. The more time passes, the less I cared for the sword stuff. It feels like, it just feels tonally different from what the sitcom stuff in Westview was. And I didn't find Hayward to be that compelling of a character. And I was really liking what they were doing with Wanda, but I didn't like what the finale tries to do with her and try to make her a hero who has to stop Agatha and all that, when it looked like the show was building her up to be this villain, because she took over this whole town, and which causes all these people to feel tortured, and they tried to paint her as a hero in this finale, and it did not feel like this is what the show was building up to at all. And I didn't like the way they kind of wrapped up her story on this show in the end, and that's something I'm really hoping Multiverse of Madness will fix, or even just see how that progresses. And I do think the emotional moments actually work really well, and I thought the finale was pretty underwhelming. I thought this did not feel like it fits with what the show's about. It just feels so much action and spectacle. It feels like we're back to what the MCU usually does. And it did not fit the show for me. It did not feel like a satisfying ending. And by far, it has my least favorite finale out of the MCU Disney Plus shows. So I love a lot of the high highs. There's some great episodes, great sitcom stuff, and I enjoyed the mystery. But the payoff did not really pay off in some aspects. Coming up next is Eternals. This is the most divisive MCU movie of all time. I remembered when the reviews came out, everybody was freaking out about it. People were loving this movie. People were not liking this movie. And people were just split in the middle of it. And for me, this was one of the MCU movies that I had some pretty high expectations for, and it didn't quite meet it. Now, before that said, I did enjoy the acting. I really enjoyed Richard Madden and Don Lee and Kumail and Angelina Jolie and all of them. I thought the acting is great. It's easily one of the best looking MCU movies, and I really enjoyed that it's different from everything before, and that Chloe Zhao tried to be ambitious with this movie and do something that the MCU, that just MCU movies haven't really done until this one. However, this movie definitely would have worked a lot better as a Disney Plus show because there were simply too many characters to do all in one movie because they got to introduce them, develop what their abilities are, and their stance on humanity. There was simply too much characters, and they had too little screen time and a lack of character development for a majority of these characters. And it made it hard for me to really care for them when I just met them. And I don't know much about these characters to really feel for them when this stuff is happening to them. And I thought the villain Crow, even though there's a twist to it, was underwhelming. And while there are some big ambitions here, it tries to be risky and bold, which I do appreciate. It doesn't always pay off, and at times I can't help but feel like this movie deserved to be a Disney Plus show or even as a two-part movie because this story was too convoluted to be done all in one movie. Oh, even the story structure, which I didn't bring up. This is a messy story structure. Just the way they had flashbacks in there just to introduce this character who now is back in the fold and all that. It just really hinders the story and it just tampers it in a way that sort of brings it down for me. And because there are too many characters, again, if your names aren't Cersei, Icarus, or Sprite, you're not going to get all that much development. And while there are some good action sequences, some great ideas here, I think the story structure really brings this one down. Next up is Ant-Man. This is one of the more fun standalone MCU movies. It's a small scale movie, and compared to everything else, it's a little inconsequential, but this is a fun movie. I really enjoyed Paul Rudd as Scott Lang and Michael Douglas and Evangeline Lilly, and I thought this is just one of the more laid-back MCU movies, especially coming off from Age of Ultron. And I love the heist movie. It definitely does a good job at being a heist movie. And the comedy, I think, works really well. It's one of the funnier MCU movies. And it's just a fun movie to watch. I had a blast with it. Now, sure, there's some things that don't always work. Yellow Jacket's motivations is similar to that of ironmongers and villains that we've seen before this. And at times, it feels like there's some problems with just the story here and there. But in general, I just had a fun time with this movie. Ant-Man is a blast. Next up is Hawkeye. I'm so happy the fact that we finally got a Hawkeye property in the MCU because out of one of these, at the time, Black Widow was getting a movie, but Hawkeye doesn't have his own movie or something, and I'm so glad we have this show. I really enjoyed Jeremy Renner and Haley Steinfeld's dynamic with each other. They were so fun to watch, and I love the Christmas setting here. It's easy. It's the most easygoing and smaller scale MCU Disney Plus show of the five, and I really enjoy that they brought back Vincent D'Onofrio as the one and only Wilson Fisk. There are some good action sequences from episode 3 and onward. It's a fun show. There's some great stuff to be found here, and I loved how they finally gave Clint time to shine and also develop Kate Bishop. And I just enjoyed this mystery of Ronan, which they were finally able to explore more of after Avengers End Game. However, this feels like the most rushed of the shows to me. Echo was a great character, but how she suddenly turns against Fisk and them and kills Kazi in the finale felt like we missed out on like 2 episodes of development. And it certainly feels like they were trying to just rush everything into 6 episodes. And I definitely feel like they needed a whole lot more than 6 episodes. And not only that too, but the finale itself, I think, is fun. It's entertaining. But because the show feels rushed, it doesn't always do all of these things justice. And while I did enjoy the Yelena aspect of the show, because I do love Florence Pugh as the character, and her dynamic with Haley Steinfeld's Kate Bishop is really fun, it feels like they shoehorned it way too late into the show, especially that we were now 2 episodes away from the finale, and now they introduced her. And I feel like this show needed to be a whole lot more than 6 episodes, and it is a fun show, and I was really happy to just watch it, and it is a show that I did really like for the most part, and it also had a pretty slow start too. So in the end, Hawkeye is a show that I enjoyed, had a great time with it. It's definitely one that I really enjoyed watching, but it easily feels like the most rushed of the shows. Next up is Doctor Strange. It's easily one of the best looking MCU movies from a visual standpoint, and I really enjoyed this tale of a neurosurgeon who, in a car accident, just lost the use of his hands. They got messed up, and so he finds the Ancient One, and he learns how to be a magician and a sorcerer, and then he gets thrust into this battle against Caecilius and the forces of darkness, and I love seeing Strange become Doctor Strange. Over the course of the movie, he tries to learn his skills and use all this magic, and really fun to see, and it's a visually pleasing movie at that. Sometimes it feels like a very formulaic MCU movie, and Caecilius isn't that compelling of a villain despite having a really great actor as the character. I had a fun time with Doctor Strange. It's one of the best MCU origin story films, and it's just a really fun movie, and it did a great job introducing Doctor Strange, who as time went on is just one of the best characters to ever grace the MCU. Kicking off our top 16 is Captain America, the First Avenger. I love this movie. It's the most underrated MCU movie of the bunch, in my opinion. It does a great job at introducing Steve Rogers to the MCU. And as a World War II movie in this MCU, it does a great job at it. I really like the origin story of seeing Steve become a hero and to be selfless and brave as he really wanted to join the army, and then the super soldier serum helped him become one. And I just love seeing Steve try to save everyone, try to be a hero, try to stop Red Skull and Hydra. It's a really fun movie, and it's probably one of the better origin stories in the MCU, and it's a really fun one at that. And I enjoyed how it sets him up to be where he is in the present day, and it really does a great job at kicking off the character's long-running arc in the MCU, and it is elevated by how Endgame was able to do a great job at wrapping up that story. Next up is Spider-Man Homecoming. After Captain America Civil War, I was so excited to see my favorite Marvel superhero, and just superhero in general, to join the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I was so happy to see his first movie in the MCU. I thought Tom Holland is great as this character. I love him a lot as Spider-Man. I think he looks the part. He is very charming, and I really enjoyed his take on this character. And Michael Keaton as Vulture is one of the best villains in the entire MCU, and I love that twist where it was revealed that he is Liz's dad. And it's a fun, small-scale movie, and I enjoyed just seeing Spider-Man try to find his place in this wider MCU now that he helped fight alongside Team Iron Man in Civil War. And it's a well-paced movie. It's fun. It's one of the more lighthearted MCU movies, and it's a fun time. However, I don't think the visual effects were all that great at times. Sometimes it looks like the suit looks very CGI, and sometimes I feel like the movie could be trimmed a little bit in pacing, because I do prefer this to Far From Home, but I do think Far From Home was just a better paced movie. And in general, I thought Homecoming is a fun movie. It's easily one of the better Spider-Man movies in my opinion, and I enjoy Tom's character, and it's just an all-around fun time. Next up is Black Panther. This is one of the more thematically richer MCU movies in terms of story, because it tries to deal with some modern day topics. And I absolutely love Chadwick Boseman as his character and Michael B. Jordan as Eric Killmonger. He is one of the best villains to ever join the MCU, and I really enjoyed the conflict between the two of them. And I loved how this movie tries to really give you all these messages about modern day, and I think they do a great job at translating it into this movie's story. And it also feels like The Lion King in the MCU, and I love The Lion King. And in the end, I think it's also one of the more emotional MCU movies. There are a lot of scenes here and there that do make me shed tears and just make me feel really emotional on the inside. So Black Panther does a really good job at making you feel things, and especially just knowing what happens with the character later on. I love Black Panther. I love this movie. Even though the action sequences are just kind of not too special, there's some good stuff here and there, but the action sequences aren't really the standout of the movie, and I think the third act is very CG heavy, and some of the visual effects don't always look all that great. But from a story perspective and a performance perspective and the production value and directing by Ryan Coogler, Black Panther is a triumph. In 13th place is The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I had a fun time with this show. I was really excited for this show ever since they first announced it 3 years ago. And I was really excited to just see Bucky Barnes and Sam Wilson get their own property and be lead characters in their own show. And I love Captain America as a character in the MCU and just in general, so I was really excited to see this show do that. And I think it did a terrific job at that, to be fair. I thought the action sequences are really great. I love seeing Sam Wilson become Captain America over the course of the show, where he learns that as he declined the mantle and the role as Captain America. I love that as the show progresses, he learns he is the only choice. He needs to do what Steve wanted and to be Captain America, and I really enjoyed that. And I enjoyed seeing Bucky be free of Hydra as the show goes on. He tries to free himself from the guilt of his past, and this show is finally the show to do that. And I really enjoyed it. And I love the Isaiah Bradley stuff a lot. It feels very heartfelt and emotional, and it really elevates seeing Sam finally become Captain America. And there's some great cinematography work here and there, and I love that we got to see Zemo come back, and just the fact that we got to see Zemo dance. However, the Flag Smashers are not great villains. They are easily the worst part about the show. It just, every time they're on screen, I'm not really that engaged, and I just don't get their motivation, because sometimes they're like, oh, we want to help people, but then they blow up a building full of people in it where apparently 3 people died, and then the next episode it's like, no, we want to help people and do all that, yet they do all these really questionable things. They just got really frustrating to deal with at times, and I just was like, can Sam and Bucky them just defeat them already? And I enjoyed seeing Sam and Bucky, and seeing even John Walker's arc, I think, is great. I loved him on the show. Wyatt Russell was really great. And I do think all that was great, but I just did not care for the Flag Smashers. Whenever they were on the show, it just doesn't engage me as much as when they focus on everyone else. And I think the finale was good. It was a bit rushed, but I loved that the show finally delivered what it wants to do, and that is to help make Sam become the next Captain America of the MCU. Following that is Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. This movie blew me away. I had so much fun with this movie. I loved Simu Liu as this character. The action sequences are the best in the MCU. Love the martial arts, and I love how it was filmed. And even the score, I think, is really great. And Wenwu is one of the most compelling antagonists in the MCU. And I really enjoyed how well-paced it was in the action. And it's also one of the more unique MCU movies, because it definitely felt like Destin Daniel Cretton was able to bring in his own style into the MCU with this movie. And I love the family drama aspect of this movie, especially with the martial arts. And I thought these new characters are really great. Now, the third act can be a bit generic, and the humor doesn't always land, and certainly I wanted more of certain characters, but I had a blast with Shang-Chi. This is one of the more surprising entries in the MCU. It's really heartfelt, and it is easily one of the best installments. Next up is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I love the Guardians of the Galaxy characters a lot. The first movie was just amazing, and I was so excited for this sequel, and I love the sequel. It's one of the best-looking MCU movies ever, and I love just seeing a more character-driven MCU sequel, where the first movie was very plot-driven. This one focused more on the characters, and it develops all of them. Maybe not as much of Drax, but I thought Ego was a much better villain in the MCU. For the Guardians movies, then Ronin, and I really enjoyed Yondu's story arc a lot. It's very heartfelt. It's really sad to watch, but it's done beautifully. And I love how the story is all about fathers and finding family. And I think James Gunn really executed that very well. And the soundtrack is really fantastic. It's just so catchy. Lots of great songs. And I love seeing him develop the characters like Star-Lord, Rocket, Yondu, and Gamora. I love this movie. I love how it's one of the more character-driven installments. Sure, the runtime of this movie feels a little long in the middle because I do feel like the pacing, once the Guardians split up, feels a little slow. Not too much, but a little bit. And I definitely feel like some of the humor doesn't always land, but I thought the highs were really high with this movie, and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is one of the best sequels in the MCU, and it's also one of the more heartfelt, emotional, and one of the most beautiful MCU movies to date. Coming up next is Thor Ragnarok. This is my favorite of the Thor movies by a long shot. It's so fun. It revives this character for me because I really liked Thor. But his movies were always kind of one of my least favorites in the MCU. But Thor Ragnarok it revives this character for me. I think it's so fun. It's colorful for the most part. It's also very electrifying and really fun to watch. And it's easily one of the more humorous installments in the MCU, and it was done really well. And I enjoyed the fight sequences in this movie, especially the gladiator battle between Thor and Hulk. And I really enjoyed what they did with Thor and Loki with their dynamic here. And Hela, I think, was a pretty good antagonist at that. And while my only problem with this movie is that sometimes there are a tad too many jokes in this movie, and it undercuts certain emotional moments, which I feel like I could have been done without that. But I think Taika Waititi easily revives this character for me. Next up is Loki. This is the best of the MCU Disney Plus shows to me. It's the best paced of the shows. It also is the most visually best looking of the bunch. And I love how they told this detective story with Loki. Well, maybe not as much detective, but I really enjoyed the mystery of the show with who's this variant, who's this person they're trying to go after, and how Loki is caught in this conspiracy and that Loki must solve this. And I really enjoyed his dynamic with Owen Wilson as Mobius. Really fun to watch, and I really enjoyed the action sequences that we had here. And it has one of the best scores in the MCU. The opening intro, the theme is great, and it's one of the more interesting, engaging MCU projects. And I had a blast with Loki, and I do really like the finale. There's some emotional moments, there is some shocking moments, and I thought the finale does a great job at making the season end in a place where you really want to see what happens next, and it changes the MCU forever. Next up is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1. This was one of the most shocking and surprising MCU movies ever made. Everybody thought they were crazy for making this movie happen because they thought, how is this going to do any good? And it knocked it out of the park. I love these new characters. I love Chris Pratt and Zoe Saldana and Vin Diesel and Dave Bautista and Bradley Cooper as these Guardians. And I really enjoyed how humorous and heartfelt this movie is. There's a heart and soul to be found here. And it's one of the best paced MCU movies. And it's one of the most unique because this was an MCU movie that truly goes with the cosmic side of the universe. And it is such a blast to watch, and James Gunn really just changed the MCU with this movie, and I absolutely adore it. Next up is Iron Man 1, the one that started it all. This movie is terrific. I love Robert Downey Jr. as his character, and it is a small origin story about a billionaire who got captured by a terrorist group, and he builds a suit of armor and later becomes a superhero known as Iron Man. It is a great origin story. It's a fun one. It's a well-paced movie. Jon Favreau did a great job directing it, and I really enjoyed Jeff Bridges as Ironmonger. He's the first MCU villain to exist in the film since they started, and I really enjoyed him. And this movie has some really great connections to some of the later movies like Endgame, like Infinity War, and even in Iron Man 2 at least. There's some great stuff to be had here, and it hits so differently now that Avengers End Game has been released. Next up is The Avengers. Now, this movie is pretty important in my childhood because this is the first live-action Marvel movie I've seen. It's the first PG-13 live-action movie I've seen. And this is the first MCU movie I've ever seen. So, and I love the cartoon Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, so I was really excited for this movie, and I loved it. I loved how it was able to bring Phase 1 together and get Iron Man and Thor and Hulk and Captain America and Black Widow and Hawkeye to team up against Loki and the forces of that work for him that are trying to take over the world. I loved it. It's a very fun movie. There's some witty moments here and there, and I think that the action sequences are great, especially the third act of this movie. And it is an important one because this is the biggest comic book movie at that time, at least in terms of scale, and it really changes the MCU for good. Once the Avengers first happened, it all just blows up from there, from how big they were able to expand the MCU. And Loki is a great antagonist in this movie. Now, my only real complaint, but that would be more of a nitpick, would just be that the visuals don't hold up as well as it did back when it came out. Because now that you had Infinity War and Guardians 2 and even Spider-Man No Way Home, the visuals here, especially with how the movie looks, probably doesn't hold up anymore, but I still love this movie. Aside from that, it's an important movie to me, and I love it for what it was able to accomplish. Next up is Captain America, the Winter Soldier. This movie is awesome. It's one of the best MCU movies from a filmmaking standpoint. It's intense. It's one of the more darker installments, and it's really intense. It is such a blast to watch. I love seeing Captain America deal with being in a more modern day world than what he was used to back in the 40s. And I love this, that he's get tied to this conspiracy theory about S.H.I.E.L.D. and how he teams up with Black Widow, and that we got to meet Falcon. And I thought Sebastian Stan was absolutely awesome as the Winter Soldier in this movie. He was a really compelling character here, and he was menacing here. And the villains, even by Robert Redford, I think is great. I just think this has some of the best action sequences ever put in the MCU. It's intense. It's one of the more darker ones. It's also one of the more serious MCU installments, and I love that this movie feels more like it's a political thriller than a superhero movie. And I love that they were able to do all of that with a character like Captain America. And this is a movie that I absolutely love. It's so rewatchable. It's so great. And for that reason, it comes in at number 5. Next up is Captain America Civil War. I love this movie. This is probably my most watched MCU movie ever because I was so excited for this movie since the first trailer came out, and it did a great job at introducing characters like Black Panther and Spider-Man. And I was so excited for what the MCU had to offer after this movie because I loved how it sets up everything else to follow and how it followed Age of Ultron. And I love that this movie just deals with Steve trying to save and find Bucky, especially as something bad happened. And I love how it creates a divide with the Avengers. How you have Team Cap, they're not for the Sokovia Accords, but Team Iron Man is like, we got to do this. This is what the people want. And how it really gives us consequences for what these heroes can do and how dangerous they can be. And just what it means for the future of the MCU and even the fate of the Avengers. And I love seeing Zemo, who is a great antagonist here, by the way, like cause a divide. He does his best to break them up And I think they did such a great job with this movie. It's also, the action sequences here are awesome, and it is such an emotional movie at that too, especially in the third act, which is one of the best climaxes in an MCU movie, because it's not this grand big explosions happening across a city, but it's a small scale climax between Captain America, Iron Man, and Bucky, and it's emotional, especially when it ends. And it left me wondering, how are the Avengers going to come back together? How are they going to make up for this? And this movie is so great, and the Russo brothers pulled it off. Kicking off number 3 is Spider-Man No Way Home. You see this shirt I'm wearing? You see it? Yes, I had to. This movie is an absolute love letter and a tribute to Spider-Man. It is the best Spider-Man movie in the MCU. It's really emotional. It's really heartfelt too. It has a heart and soul. And I love how it follows his character after the cliffhanger of Far From Home. It has some amazing action set pieces, especially the third act of this movie, and Spider-Man versus Green Goblin is awesome, especially the one fight between him and Doc Ock early on in the movie. It is such a terrific movie that I love. It does a lot of things that could not have worked, but it did. It did it so well, and John Watts and the writers did such a great job telling this new story with Tom Spider-Man while also honoring and tributing what came before with the Raimi trilogy and the TASM movies. And I really liked how they were able to bring back Willem Dafoe and Alfred Molina and Jamie Foxx and Rhys Ifans and Tom St. Church. And also, they did a miraculously amazing job with how they handled Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield in this movie. Just seeing all 3 Spider-Men together, that is amazing. I never thought we were ever going to see this happen on screen, and here we are. And they did it to absolute perfection, if I might add. Their banter together, the third act, the action sequences, the emotions. It has such a great story and does such a great job at it. And I love this movie so much as a Spider-Man fan, and for how it was able to elevate not just everything that came before MCU Spidey, but it elevated every single Spider-Man movie to ever exist. And I love how it ends they ended this movie with Spider-Man now back to square one, and I really can't wait to see what they do with him from this point on. Second place is Avengers Infinity War. This is one of the biggest movies of all time, and there's a good reason for it. I absolutely love this movie. It's one of the best paced. It's intense. It's engaging. I was on the edge of my seat from the beginning of this movie all the way to when the credits roll. Thanos is a compelling villain. I loved Josh Brolin as his character and how the Russos were able to make him a more sympathetic character, and how he had the most screen time out of everyone in this movie. And I love how the Russos were able to take all these MCU heroes and make them in pairs. You have Iron Man, Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, Captain America, Black Widow, and Falcon, Star-Lord, Drax, and Mantis, and Thor, Rocket, and Groot. And I love how they're able to do it. The action sequences are spectacular. The score by Alan Silvestri is amazing. And the action sequences are some of the best in the MCU, alongside Shang-Chi and Captain America and the Winter Soldier and No Way Home. And this is one of the most devastating because of how it ends. And for a whole year, it made me wonder, how are the Avengers going to save the universe after this? It is an all-out masterpiece that I absolutely adore. And it is one that will always remain to be one of the best comic book movies to exist. But coming in first place is Avengers End Game. I love this movie so much. It means so much to me that they were able to tribute the MCU and wrap up the entire Infinity Saga on such a high note. It is one of the most satisfying movies and theater experiences I have ever had in my life. And I love how the Russo brothers were able to tell this story. It was able to give a last hurrah to the original 6 Avengers, while also having characters like Ant-Man and Nebula and War Machine and Rocket helping them out. And I love how This movie just tributes everything that came before it. It elevates every MCU movie before this. And I love how they were able to tell the story of the Avengers broken from the fallout of Infinity War and how they gotta get the gang back together. They have one shot to save the universe and bring everyone back. And I absolutely loved it. I love the time travel idea. I love that they went back to three different time periods throughout the Infinity Saga to get the stones, because it tributes what I love about the MCU. And I absolutely had a blast with this movie. I think there's some great humorous moments to be had here. And I love, it is one of the most emotional movies in this saga. I loved how they were able to handle character arcs in this movie. Iron Man's arc was done perfectly, and how he sacrifices himself to save the universe and to bring everyone back, I think is absolutely poetic. And it is just such an amazing way to wrap up his story ever since the first Iron Man movie. And Captain America now, I love that character so much, and I love how they handled him here. I think how Captain America just gets to finally live the life he's always wanted, I think is beautiful. It really does a great job at ending his story ever since Captain America the First Avenger to me. The action sequences are great. The third act is probably my favorite third act in the history of not just the MCU, but movies in general. Like, I love the superhero genre so much. And I love how they're able to pull it off. It's massive in scale. There's a lot of awesome moments that happen. And I love the score by Alan Silvestri here. It's his best score he's ever composed, in my opinion. And it's just such a perfect movie to me. There are some nitpicks I could make about the movie, but I just love it so much. I love what it was able to accomplish and how it was able to wrap up the saga. It's easily one of the most satisfying endings I've ever seen for a movie. And the opening night of Endgame is one of the best experiences I've ever had in theaters and probably ever will have. And this is a movie that I absolutely adore for so many reasons. So for that reason, Avengers Endgame comes in at number 1. What's your ranking of the MCU? I would love to hear it down below in the comment section, and I'd love to hear it. There's a lot of great stuff here, from the movies to the Disney Plus show, so I'd love to see what would your ranking of the MCU be. Let me know down below in the comment section, and thank you guys so much for watching, and don't forget to hit that like button and the subscribe button, and stay tuned for more.